Thanks so much, Rachel, and thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Emily May. I'm a Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Pesticide Program at Xerces. And my work at Xerces since 2015 has focused on supporting pollinators with habitat creation and protecting them from pesticides. So thank you for joining us for this webinar today on herbicides and pollinators. Herbicides are the most widely used pesticides globally. They are used across agricultural, residential, natural areas, rangelands, forested areas. They are very widely used, and they are often used around and on plants visited by pollinators. So today we're going to talk about both sides of the herbicide coin. We're going to talk about how herbicides can pose a threat to pollinators and how they also can be used as a tool for ecosystem restoration and restoration of native plant communities. We're going to talk about what's known, current research on the impacts of herbicides on pollinators, both the unintended consequences of their use in terms of the loss of flowering plants across wide landscapes, and also direct harm from contact with herbicides. We'll talk about best practices and alternative methods for managing invasive plants and restoring ecosystems, and talk about strategies for minimizing herbicide risks to pollinators when they are used. So it's going to be a wide-ranging conversation today. To take a step back and set the stage for this talk, let's just take a look at one of the central goals of the Xerces Pesticide Program, which is to help all landscapes, urban, agricultural, natural areas, realize the potential for successful pollinator conservation. Pollinators need three basic things. They need food, shelter, and protection from pesticides. For bees, food and shelter is these flowering plants that are providing pollen and nectar, undisturbed spaces to nest in the ground or plant stems. Healthy habitat is this base of the pyramid for pollinator protection. And to keep habitat healthy, you have to protect pollinators and their habitat from pesticides, which includes insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides, or pesticides that kill plants. So we're approaching herbicides differently for different audiences who are using these chemicals in different ways, different contexts, for different purposes. The solutions that exist for a home gardener that's managing a small urban lot are generally going to be different than what's going on with someone who's managing large acreage or agricultural crops or a heavily degraded natural area with challenging invasive species. So our approach is always to try and meet people where they are, but also to bring them out of their comfort zone a bit. And we want everyone to understand the risks so that they can make the best possible choices within their situation. So a short outline of what we're going to cover today. We're going to start with a brief introduction to herbicides. When did they come into use? What are their major uses today? And then we're going to talk about how they can pose risks to pollinators from large-scale loss of habitat across millions of acres down to the much smaller scale of what happens when a pollinator actually comes into contact with an herbicide. We'll move from there into talking about some herbicide uses for conservation purposes, such as invasive plant management in natural areas and preparing areas for seeding wildflowers. Probably you're all familiar with both of those uses for herbicides. And then we'll end with talking about best practices for using herbicides in conservation as part of an integrated weed management approach. So let's start with some herbicide history. Before the Second World War, farmers used a combination of manual strategies to control unwanted plants in crop fields, including tillage, rotating crops, weeding by hand or mechanically. And there were a few chemicals that were tried for use as weed control, including salt, copper sulfate or blue vitriol, sodium arsenite, and sulfuric acid. Some of these required really high rates, like up to 1 ton an acre for controlling weeds. In the 1940s, that changed with the discovery and commercial release of synthetic herbicides called the chemical hoe. It's dramatically changed the face of weed management in agriculture. Two of the first herbicides discovered and released in the 1940s were ones that were one that we're all still familiar with, which is 2,4-D, and then another similar herbicide, 2,4,5-T. And the Agent Orange, which was the defoliant used by the US on millions of hectares in Vietnam, was a 50-50 mix of these two herbicides. It was also unfortunately contaminated with dioxin, which is a byproduct of the manufacturing process of 2,4,5-T, and that caused major human health impacts across Vietnam and among war veterans. From there, from the 1950s to the 1980s, hundreds of new substances that kill plants were discovered, developed, and released. There are, on average, new herbicides, new targets or modes of action, ways that these things kill plants were discovered and released every 1 to 2 years during this time period. But since the 1980s, that has slowed down significantly. There have been no new ways to kill plants, no novel ways to kill plants released since the 1980s. In the 1990s, introduction of herbicide-resistant crops further cemented the chemical hoe, herbicides, as the primary form of managing weeds across millions of row crop acres in the US. So planting of herbicide-resistant crops, which included corn and cotton and soybean, increased really quickly after they were introduced in the mid-1990s. And since the mid-2000s, more than 9 in 10 acres of these row crops have been planted in these herbicide-resistant varieties that receive applications of glyphosate primarily to control weeds during the growing season of the crop. These crops are simple to manage, and they require low labor inputs because they're just going through with a big tractor. Herbicides now represent over half of global pesticide use and more than 80% of agricultural pesticide sales in use in the United States. So they're very widespread in use. And it's really hard to quantify what the environmental impacts have been from this deep shift in weed management practices. Like other pesticides applied to crop fields, herbicides don't stay put. They, sometimes the majority of a chemical applied to a field ends up elsewhere in the environment. And so we have found widespread contamination of soil and water, air, and non-target plants elsewhere in the environment from these herbicides, as well as other pesticides used in agricultural crops. How do herbicides work? Figured we should talk about some definitions first, because it's helpful to have that context when we're talking about these for the rest of the presentation. So herbicides are chemicals that kill or stunt plant growth in a lot of different ways. Some herbicides are inhibiting key plant processes like amino acid production, photosynthesis, cell division. Others mimic plant hormones that control how plants grow. Some of them act very quickly once they're applied. Others take weeks for symptoms to show up on the plants. So some of the things that some of the language you might see when they're looking at herbicides: contact and systemic. So contact herbicides are those that kill the plant, the part of the plant that the herbicide touches, typically just the vegetation that's above the surface of the soil. Systemic herbicides, like other systemic pesticides, are absorbed throughout the plant. They can kill or disrupt both the leaves and stems as well as the roots of the plant. Pre and post-emergent are also terms you'll see. Pre-emergent herbicides prevent seeds from germinating. Post-emergent herbicides are applied to control plants that have already emerged and are actively growing. Some herbicides are both pre and post-emergent. Then there's selective and non-selective. And this is it can be a little bit fuzzy, but selective herbicides generally control certain types or categories of plants. These can be pretty broad categories, like all broadleaf plants or all grasses. But some selective herbicides actually affect a smaller suite of species. And then non-selective herbicides can kill or disrupt all kinds of growing plants. So herbicides are a commonly used tool in conservation management. That's why we're talking about this today, as kind of this double-edged sword. They're both a conservation tool and a conservation threat. Most commonly in conservation, they're used to control invasive plant species that disrupt the balance of ecosystems and plant communities, decrease biodiversity, and impede or outcompete the growth of native plants. Herbicides are often used when other management methods, such as manual removal or prescribed burning, things like that, aren't feasible or effective for the target plants or the area being managed. In our work, we also commonly see herbicides used for site preparation for restoration projects like pollinator meadows. And we're going to talk about both of these use cases for herbicides later on in this presentation. So let's talk about the sort of big buckets of threats to pollinators from herbicide use. There are several ways in which herbicide use could threaten pollinators. One of the most significant is the landscape level use of these pesticides, landscape level habitat loss, which can occur with large scale herbicide applications for agricultural weed control, roadside management, et cetera, other kind of broad scale uses. The drift and use of herbicides can result in the loss of food sources and nesting habitats for pollinators. And alongside that loss of food and shelter, herbicides can also degrade the quality of food resources, like pollinator host plants, so decreasing the availability of high quality food sources for pollinators. And the concern here is really that loss of forage quality might lead to decreased reproductive success or population declines for pollinators. And then finally, direct harm to pollinators from herbicide exposure is also a concern. So whether that's coming into direct contact with a spray of an herbicide or coming into contact with the residues of an herbicide in the nectar of a plant, for example. This kind of exposure can have harmful effects on bees, such as lower foraging efficiency and impaired immune function. And so I'll talk more specifically about that in the following section. The biggest impact of herbicide use in agricultural landscapes for wildlife is likely this loss of plants that provide food and shelter. There are simply fewer flowering plants available in and around crop fields. And the economies of scale with this system mean that there are ever larger fields, which also means less habitat in field margins. Butterflies may be at particular risk from herbicide use that would affect the specific host plants that are the only food source for the caterpillars. The most widely used herbicide in the US, as you might guess, is glyphosate. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Roundup, Touchdown, number of other trade names for glyphosate. About 260 to 280 million pounds of glyphosate are applied to an average of about 300 million acres of cropland annually in the US. That's a lot of herbicide. Between 80 and 90% of glyphosate use in the United States is in agriculture. Milkweeds, which are the main host plant for larval monarch butterflies, are possibly the most dramatic example of herbicide impacts on pollinator food plants. So as glyphosate use in these herbicide-resistant crops increased, milkweeds also declined across the US, across the Midwest. So on the left-hand side here, this is glyphosate use by year and crop. You can kind of ignore the crops, but you can see this dramatic increase in glyphosate use from the mid-1990s through the 2000s. And research out of Iowa State found steep declines in milkweeds in agricultural and non-agricultural habitats in Iowa over that same time period. There was about a 30% decline for milkweeds outside of agricultural fields and an 80% decline of milkweeds in agricultural fields during that time period. So the right-hand side here is a graph of this Iowa State researchers' estimate of monarch egg production in the Midwest over this time frame. Herbicide-based weed management took away a lot of food resources for monarchs, and that also left them producing fewer eggs. So the reduction in food for caterpillars in breeding grounds has been linked to steep declines in monarch butterfly populations over that same time period. It's not the only thing contributing to monarch declines, but it is a contributor. Thanks to years of overuse of glyphosate, we're also seeing the breakdown of that weed management system in herbicide-resistant crops. So there are dozens of glyphosate-resistant weed species now across millions of acres in the US, which has sent seed and chemical companies scrambling to develop and market new seed and chemical products for herbicide-based row crop management. So there are other herbicide-resistant varieties now to replace or supplement glyphosate, including glufosinate, dicamba, and 2,4-D resistant crops. You'll remember 2,4-D is one of the very first herbicides introduced in the 1940s. And dicamba and 2,4-D are somewhat related herbicides. They're these herbicides that mimic plant growth hormones, and they are very prone to drift or moving away from the site of application. Increasing use of these two herbicides in resistant crops for mid-season weed control, using them in May, June, sometimes July, across millions of acres has led to tens of thousands of reported drift incidents from these herbicides affecting crops, affecting native trees, other wild plants, home gardens. So this herbicide drift can also affect the quality and diversity and quantity of pollinator food plants outside of crop fields. Drift can occur on a pretty big spectrum, from outright killing of a plant to changes in their ability to photosynthesize or grow, produce nectar. So this is an image here of a oak tree that's got dicamba damage on it. That's some of the classic cupping that you would see, cupping and curling from a plant being affected by drift from a plant growth regulator like dicamba and 2,4-D. So these low level doses of drift from these herbicides can affect plant health, nectar production, and the ability of these plants to reproduce in their environments. So we're concerned here that reductions in plants' ability to reproduce, to grow well, could lead to changes in plant communities and could also lead to reductions in quality for pollinator host plants. So the big picture here really is that, at least in agriculture, farmers are stuck on this treadmill of herbicides that is increasingly bad at managing weeds and increasingly harmful to the environment and to pollinators. So that gives you a sense for the landscape level impacts of herbicide use on pollinators, this loss of food and shelter. But let's turn now to talk about what's known about how herbicides might directly harm a pollinator that comes into contact with an herbicide, whether that's with an application that they contact directly or with herbicide residues in nectar, leaves, or soil. So when we're talking about direct harm, we're talking about this intersection of toxicity of a pesticide and exposure to that pesticide. These are the two factors that contribute to how risky any pesticide is for pollinators, or for anything really. How toxic is it and in what way? And then how much of the pesticide was a pollinator exposed to? Was it exposed on the outside of its body? Did it eat it in pollen and nectar or in the leaves of its host plant? How long was it exposed for? Was it a one-time pesticide application, or was this pollinator being exposed continuously in contaminated food? So basically what this boils down to is the dose makes the poison. A highly toxic pesticide that a pollinator is really minimally exposed to might actually be less risky than a less toxic pesticide that a pollinator is exposed to continuously. The most risky, obviously, would be a highly toxic pesticide and a high dose exposure. So this whole equation is the framework for understanding how we can also reduce risk to pollinators. Sometimes it's about reducing the toxicity of pesticides used, and sometimes it's about how to protect pollinators and their habitat from exposure. So before we talk through some of the toxic effects of herbicides, let's talk about how pollinators could be exposed. And this is a really important piece to think through for any pesticide, again, because it helps us to figure out how to reduce that risk by reducing the dose that a pollinator might be exposed to. So the most obvious here would be direct contact with an herbicide application as it's being applied, so contacting on the outside of the body. Herbicide residues are also found throughout air, soil, water, and plant samples taken in agricultural landscapes. So a pollinator might walk over the surface of a treated plant that has residues on it. They might bring pieces of, for bees like leafcutter bees, might bring pieces of treated plants back to their nest and make their nest out of contaminated plant materials. They could be building nests underground in soils contaminated with herbicides, or they might be bringing herbicides back in the form of contaminated nectar or pollen. And this is actually a really big one that we want to be thinking about, is how can we avoid circumstances where pollinators are picking up herbicides in nectar, because there is this window after an herbicide application when a systemic herbicide might be taken up into the nectar of the plant before the plant shows any outward signs of having been contacted with an herbicide. It could be a couple of days, it could be a week or two, before the plant shows symptoms of responding to the herbicide, but that herbicide is present in the nectar. So that's something we really want to be cautious of and aware of with herbicides ending up in the nectar of plants. We don't want to be applying herbicides on or near flowering plants where pollinators might then be bringing contaminated nectar back to their babies. So that's how pollinators can be exposed. They could be exposed on the outsides of their bodies or in their food. But what happens when they're exposed to some dose of an herbicide? What do we know about the toxicity of herbicides to bees and other pollinators? So a lot of what we know in general about the toxicity of pesticides to bees is from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, the agency that regulates pesticides and registers them for use. They require standard laboratory toxicity testing of adult honeybees in order to register a pesticide for use in the US. And these tests basically look for what dose of a pesticide kills half of that test population of bees in the lab. So the smaller the dose it takes to kill half those bees, the higher the toxicity of that pesticide. And this test is a really crude screen for what pesticides are most toxic to bees. As you might expect, in general, insecticides or pesticides that are designed to kill insects are much more likely to kill a bee than an herbicide, which is a pesticide designed to kill plants. But as you might know from ingesting almost any kind of pharmaceutical drug, death is not the only endpoint that matters for your health. So bees, unfortunately, don't have a doctor standing by listing off dozens of potential side effects before they get exposed to different pesticides in the field. And the EPA rarely looks beyond, well, how much does it take to kill them when they register a pesticide? So beyond that basic toxicity testing that EPA requires, there is relatively limited field and lab research on the toxicity of herbicides to pollinators. But even that limited research gives us a decently long list of potential side effects. Studies conducted with honeybees, which most of these toxicity studies have found a variety of harmful effects, which we will talk about more in just a minute. There's little research on endpoints other than killing a bee, and most research has been conducted on glyphosate. So honeybees are typically used as this surrogate species for other pollinators, even things that aren't bees. They're not always the best subjects for representing what pesticides are going to do to other bee species and other pollinators, but that's what we have data on. And most studies of herbicide toxicity to honeybees have been conducted with glyphosate. This makes a lot of sense. It's the most widely used herbicide in the world. But when you hear about the impacts of glyphosate on bees, I do want you to keep in mind that this really isn't because glyphosate is necessarily worse than any other herbicide. It's just the herbicide that receives the most attention because it's used so commonly throughout all kinds of landscapes. But taking glyphosate as an example, here are some of the sublethal effects that researchers have seen from exposures in bees. And sublethal is a word that sometimes slips out when I'm talking, but it just means these endpoints for harm that don't reach the level of actually killing a bee. Sublethal, but it's basically just a way to say harm. So researchers have identified sublethal impacts from consumption of glyphosate, including disturbances to the microbiome of the gut in honeybees, delayed molting, reduced brood survival and reduced weight, impaired ability to navigate and learn and have memory, and then effects on immune function. So some of these effects might not seem that significant, but they actually can pose problems for the overall survival of bees. Thinking about something like the gut microbiome, disturbances to the gut microbiome can make them more susceptible to gut pathogens, which lead to other sort of survival outcomes for those individuals that might not be seen, on initial glance when you're looking at just, did this pesticide kill this bee within 48 hours of them contacting it? And some of these impacts could be worse, for something like a solitary native bee species that doesn't have a colony, a hive to buffer the effects of a pesticide exposure on an individual. So those solitary females out there doing all of the duties of collecting food for their babies and building their nest, they get exposed to a pesticide and die, that nest creation is over, their reproductive season is over. Honeybees and other social bees have a little bit more of a buffer in the sense that an individual forager death means less for the overall colony. Getting back to direct impacts, other herbicides that have lab and field evidence for physiological and behavioral impacts on larval or adult honeybees include paraquat, 2,4-D, atrazine, metolachlor, a few others, but I really can't stress enough that research on direct toxicity is extremely limited, and many other herbicides could have similar impacts. They just haven't been tested in the lab or the field. There have been more studies coming out in the last few years, so I hope that we're starting to get a better sense for where some of the concerns are going to be. But their findings are suggesting that there may be more direct impacts on pollinators than expected. This is actually also the case for fungicides, which were historically somewhat ignored for their toxic effects on pollinators, again, because they were missed in that direct screen required for pesticide registration by the EPA. But research is identifying some concerning patterns of toxicity in pollinators. So this is a much more active area of research than it used to be, and I hope we'll continue to learn more. So why are we concerned here about these herbicide effects on individuals? They might not kill a foraging bee outright, like an insecticide could, but what we think is important to keep in mind is that these herbicide effects on individuals can add up to larger impacts at the colony scale or the population scale. So exposure to herbicides that impair a bee's immune system or decrease its foraging ability, disrupt its reproductive success, can ripple up to have these larger impacts, leading to lower reproduction and health at the colony level, or taking it a step further. When lots of bees are exposed to herbicides across the landscape, we could see reductions in reproduction, at the individual level that then lead to reduced population growth rates or even declines. So these larger ripple effects of herbicides and other pesticides and their use on pollinators is why we are emphasizing a precautionary approach to try and minimize harm. So this presentation is really about all pollinators, and there is some research available on butterflies as well. Research on butterflies is even more sparse than it was on bees, but there are a few that have looked at direct impacts of herbicide exposure. One study found that exposure to clopyralid affected larval development time of a silver spot butterfly species. Exposure to a grass-selective herbicide, fluazafop, reduced pupil mass of the same species. And the authors suggested that those effects might have resulted from stress of having to detoxify that herbicide, which could affect growth rates and pupil mass in Lepidoptera. As we talked about before, herbicide drift can also reduce forage quality as well as directly impact butterflies. There was one study that looked at drift level doses of dicamba, which reduced the growth and nitrogen content of thistles, which are host plants of the painted lady butterfly, which led to smaller caterpillars and pupa from butterflies that had been feeding on those dicamba-treated plants. Another study looked at exposure to herbicides containing imazapyr, cethoxidime, and triclopyr, and found reduced larval survivorship across all three in a metalmark butterfly species. And the authors actually suspected in this case that the toxicity that they saw could be due to inert or not what you might call non-active ingredients in the formulations of herbicide products, because all three of those herbicides have different modes of action, but they had similar levels of impact on larval survivorship. And we're going to talk more about formulations here. So let's talk more about that. Pesticide products typically contain a variety of substances besides the active ingredient. The active ingredient is the main component of a pesticide that produces the target effect. So for example, Roundup is a formulated product that contains the active ingredient glyphosate. Some toxicity might actually be coming from other components in the formulation besides that active ingredient. And so impacts to bees and other invertebrates could differ depending on the specific formulation. There was a recent study looking at bumblebees and glyphosate that found significant increases in mortality from bumblebees being exposed to Roundup, but then found, looking further, that it was the formulation and not the glyphosate itself that was the toxic element for bees. So this image here on the left is percent survival of bumblebees over 24 hours when treated with water, which is that blue control line at the top, 100% survival, versus when treated with a Roundup formulation containing no glyphosate, so no active ingredient. And you can see that there's a reduced survival over 24 hours. So what's important to note here is that those EPA required standard tests for acute toxicity are conducted with just the active ingredient and not the formulated product. So again, they would be testing the toxicity of glyphosate, the active ingredient, but not Roundup, the formulated product, in those standard toxicity tests. So if the initial screen suggests that there might be adverse effects on insects, then they could conduct field testing with the formulated product. But if the toxicity is actually coming from the formulation itself, it would be missed by the standard screen. So this is a major gap in our understanding of the real-world impacts of pesticide exposure to pollinators, including herbicides. And it's also an important gap in just the basic regulatory framework for pesticides. We are registering pesticides for use without, in some cases, a full understanding of their risk to vulnerable species. So you may have signed up for this talk in the hopes that I'm going to give you a list of particularly high-risk herbicides to avoid and better alternatives. And I am sorry to say that it's really difficult to create that list of the most risky herbicides because so little testing has been done on their impacts on most invertebrates. And beyond that, many herbicides with different names have similar modes of action, meaning that simply avoiding certain chemicals is no guarantee that the alternatives are safer. There are a few factors that do increase the risk that an herbicide would pose to invertebrates, which include toxicity, so basic ability to cause harm, persistence, how long it lasts in the environment, drift and leaching and runoff, so movement through the air and the soil, and movement, off-site into field margins or into aquatic environments. So if you decide to use an herbicide, ideally it would have low toxicity, low persistence, and minimal tendency to move off-site. It's not about, in this case, making a list of specific herbicides. It's about making good choices throughout the decision-making process and taking a precautionary approach to herbicide use. So the second part of this talk is really that framework for making management decisions and best practices for making those decisions about pest or weed management. How can we use sort of a general framework to help weigh the costs and benefits of different actions, including herbicide use? So no matter who you are, no matter what you're managing, there's a set of questions you can ask yourself to help guide management. Some of the questions and the answers are going to be different depending on who you are and where you work. I myself can suppress weeds around my home by hand or with cardboard, but that might be the case, might be the case for someone managing 100 acres. The general frameworks will be the same across landscapes. So some of those questions might be, what pest or weed am I managing? What are its life cycle and its habits? Knowing the biology of a pest is important for being able to target management. What's my goal? Is it eradication? Is it containment or reducing the spread of a weed? The goal can really determine what management actions are going to make sense. What management options are available? Are they feasible? Are they effective? What other impacts might those management actions have? And then you take all of that and you think about, are the benefits of this practice going to outweigh the impacts? So we're not going to have time to go through every audience. This next section is mostly tailored to folks who are managing natural areas or acreage, larger acreage around their property, but hopefully you'll be able to take a few things home. So first we'll talk about two of the main use cases for herbicides in conservation management. The first of these is preparing a site for revegetation with a native plant community, like a pollinator meadow, and the second is invasive species management. So first, let's talk about site prep for pollinator meadows. This is a really crucial step in the process of establishing a diverse wildflower planting. Native wildflowers are good at surviving without inputs in your climate and precipitation regime, but they are not always good at competing against invasive or naturalized species that are adapted for growing fast and hogging resources. So competition with weeds, which is both the existing standing vegetation at a site and the weed seeds in the seed bed there, that's generally the top reason that wildflower plantings fail. It's not like planting a garden. You can't just till once and seed these species. They're not meant to grow quickly. Native seeds really need the right conditions to germinate and establish. And so if your goal is to get a diverse, long-lasting perennial meadow, you have to reduce or eliminate weed competition before you seed. So site preparation is typically removing existing vegetation, preparing that soil for seeding, and doing what you can to eliminate weed seeds in the seed bed. We encourage non-chemical methods when feasible and effective. Some of those include smother cropping, sheet mulching, solarization, cultivation, and sod cutting. We'll talk more about all of those. But most site prep methods have some kind of environmental trade-off. All of these methods remove floral resources for the year that they're in use. Most of them, including all three pictured here, are likely to affect microbial communities in the soil. Solarization or using plastic tarps to prepare a site can be effective, especially in areas that get really hot for a while over the summer. But concerns include plastic waste, microplastic pollution. Repeated tillage can be rough on soil aggregate stability, soil health, can lead to erosion when used on slope sites. And then there's herbicides, which are less likely to lead to erosion, but can have some mixed impacts on soil arthropods and microbial communities. And depending on the chemical and application type, they could move off-site by drift or leaching. So all of these have trade-offs in terms of cost, efficacy, and potential impacts. If you're preparing a small site for planting or converting your lawn, I would encourage you to look at methods like sheet mulching or sod cutting. Sheet mulching is just another name for lasagna gardening, or using layers of materials like cardboard and wood chips and organic materials to mulch out weeds. And then sod cutting, a sod cutter is just a machine with a blade that cuts turf off about 2 inches below the surface. I just did this the last weekend for Earth Day, which these are somewhat more labor intensive methods. It took me a full day and a sore back to get the sod cutting to work in my front lawn, but they have relatively few other trade-offs. But if you're looking to convert a half acre or more, those methods are going to be much less feasible. One other method to consider is smother cropping, which is using a competitive cover crop to smother out weeds in an area. And this method can be effective, but it does require strict management, strict timeline, and is better suited for areas that have pretty low weed pressure to begin with. You can't really just seed and forget about a cover crop and expect it to work for site preparation. You do have to follow a pretty strict timeline, and it's probably not going to work that well with aggressive weed species. But this photo is from Hawthorne Valley Farm in New York, one of the largest biodynamic farms in the US. They're very experienced with cover cropping, so this method fit really well into their existing management framework. And they tilled in spring before winter and spring annuals flowered, then did shallow cultivation 2 and 4 weeks later, seeded buckwheat right after that. 6 weeks later, mowed down that cover crop, seeded a second crop of buckwheat, and 6 weeks after that, mowed and left the plant material on the surface to break down, then seeded wildflowers in the fall. So that's pretty strict timeline that you have to be on top of to make this one work. But the upside is that with a smother crop like buckwheat, you have flowering resources for at least part of the season when you're preparing that site for wildflowers. So why am I harping so much on site preparation? For all these methods, we are weighing the potential short-term impacts against these long-term gains of establishing a healthy, diverse, long-lasting native plant community. This is a comparison here between two different site trajectories for a pollinator meadow, one that received thorough weed control and seedbed preparation with herbicides before seeding, and one that did not receive adequate site prep. The site that didn't have good weed control faded out before it could ever reach its full potential. Wildflower meadows take time to reach their full potential, often 3 or more years after they were first seeded. Ideally, they are getting more diverse over the first 5 years as seeds break dormancy and establish and start clumping up, rather than less diverse. But this is not what's seen when you have poor site prep and a lot of aggressive plant species there. So people will buy a great, diverse, expensive seed mix, and then only a few natives established before things like cool season grasses, plantain, bed straw, other non-native hayfield or pasture weeds start to take over. So they'll either at that point give up on the meadow or have to start over from scratch. So when you're considering how to prepare a site, we do encourage you to consider and think deeply about different site prep methods. Are they feasible? Are they effective? And what are the long-term gains for wildlife? So this is just something to give you food for thought around use of different site prep methods. And I would encourage you to go look at our organic site prep guide that's on our website. So let's talk about invasive species management next, which is the other big kind of use case for herbicides and conservation. And when we think about all of the known and unknown risks to pollinators in general, we are recommending trying to avoid unnecessary use of pesticides and protecting pollinators and their habitat as much as possible when pesticides are used. So we recommend that all pest management, whether that's insects or weeds, is occurring within the framework of a strong integrated vegetation or integrated pest management plan rooted in prevention. So remember those questions that I said you should ask of yourself when considering management options, like what you're managing and its biology and what the available options are. Integrated pest management or weed or vegetation management, they're basically structured frameworks for asking those questions and then deciding on appropriate management. So this integrated approach involves use of multiple strategies, including cultural, mechanical, chemical, and biological methods to manage populations of weeds, considering non-chemical options first. It also means making sure that staff or whoever is doing the management is trained up in plant and pest identification and biology. And it's also about reducing reliance on any one management technique. For invasive plants, monitoring and early intervention are really key. You don't need to do as much management for small early populations as you do for late stage, larger invasions. It's a lot easier to deal with a small garlic mustard plant on the top over there than it is to pull a whole hillside of it. If you do decide to manage with herbicides, we are going to talk about how to limit harm, including using targeted applications. Integrated weed management starts with prevention. How can we prevent unwanted species from reaching our property? We want to be limiting disturbance, especially that kind of disturbance that creates bare ground. So do you have someone coming to mow somewhere on your property, to brush hog your field? Talk to them, make sure that the equipment is cleaned off before they arrive so they aren't bringing unwanted weed seeds with them. We want to be preventing that movement of weed seeds from one property to another, cleaning equipment, cleaning shoes, cleaning clothing, limiting off-leash dogs in areas with public access if you're managing a public property. Are you planting transplants? Use weed-free materials. That's, fill, soils, compost, fertilizer, etc. All could potentially be bringing in weed seeds. Or species like the invasive jumping worm, which can wreak havoc on leaf litter layers. And of course, ongoing monitoring to help infestations of new weeds in the bud. That early detection and rapid response is so key to getting things under control quickly. Early detection can mean better control, can reduce the amount of herbicide needed. Stitch in time saves 9. When we're thinking about using multiple strategies for weed control, these also include cultural and mechanical strategies, like establishing desirable or competitive plants in areas where weeds are likely to compete. Perennial native grasses, other competitive native vegetation can help keep invasive species out of open space. And in turf, it might mean overseeding with high quality seeds to maintain healthy stands. So those are sort of preventive strategies. And then once weeds arrived, or if they arrive, mechanical strategies like hand weeding and digging, mowing, removing flower heads, and tilling are potential options for management of weeds. What works for you is going to depend on what weeds you're dealing with. Are you dealing with summer annuals, winter annuals like bluegrass or chickweed, simple perennials that spread by seed like dandelion or broadleaf plantain, creeping perennials, etc. So some of those are a lot easier to manage with cultural and mechanical options than others. Also obviously depends at the scale on which you're working. It's easy for me to hand pull weeds and mulch my flower beds to keep weeds from getting out of hand, but that gets trickier with the larger acreage that you're managing. But the more you can do to prevent weeds from coming in the first place and rapidly respond to small infestations, the less need you're going to have for doing cleanup. Insects, bacteria, fungi, other living organisms can also contribute to weed control. There are different forms of biological control, but in this context, the most common is classic biological control, or the introduction of natural enemies to help control an invasive species. They're typically introduced from the native range, screened for how host specific they are. There have been some disasters in the past around introducing natural enemies that thought were host specific, but in fact enjoyed dining on a variety of species. So caution is obviously warranted. The example here is of purple loosestrife beetles. So purple loosestrife is a wetland plant that spreads by prolific seed production and a web of roots, and it completely changes the ecology of wetland habitats, overtaking native aquatic plants and lowering diversity. Because it's an aquatic species, there are more limited options for both mechanical and chemical control, which is where this biological control comes in. These are different beetles that were introduced from the native range of purple loosestrife and can help keep it from spreading. The beetles often don't eradicate loosestrife stands completely, but they do help reduce the need for any other kind of intervention. But okay, I've talked a lot about different non-chemical strategies, but it's somewhat unrealistic to think we're going to eliminate all herbicide use when herbicides can sometimes be the only effective strategy for managing certain noxious and very difficult weeds. So we have to be thinking about how to mitigate risk when herbicides are used. So we want to be avoiding use of the handful of herbicides known to cause harm to pollinators. So paraquat is an example of this. You can check what's known about impacts of different pesticides to bees using the University of California IPM's bee precaution pesticide ranking tool, which is that it will give you that EPA basic standardized toxicity testing results. So if you Google bee precaution, you'll find that tool, and you can use that to compare different chemical options. It's not going to have every single product out there, but it's a handy resource for checking toxicity. A real key to minimizing risk in this case is minimizing exposure. So we want to reduce the likelihood that a pollinator is going to come into contact with that herbicide. One of the key ways to reduce that exposure is to reduce the area treated and to use application methods that are more targeted. So this might mean using spot treatments or cut stem and basal bark treatments, wick wipes on individual plants or small areas instead of broadcast foliar sprays. The less drift that we create, the less chemical we use, the less likely we are creating a hazard for pollinators. So as I mentioned earlier, we've learned in some recent studies that there is this window of application of a systemic herbicide, an herbicide that gets taken up into the roots and leaves of a plant, as many herbicides do, that some of these can get into the nectar of plants before the plants show any outward signs of damage. And then pollinators can get exposed in the contaminated nectar. So this is something we really want to avoid. We want to avoid applying to flowering plants. We want to limit direct exposure to pollinators. So this photo shows a backpack sprayer. So it's more targeted than some application methods, but it's being applied on Japanese knotweed, which is a pollinator attractive species that's in bloom. So this is not ideal in terms of minimizing exposure to pollinators. We would rather see this plant treated earlier in its life cycle before bloom, or mowed down to take away the blooms before that herbicide is applied. This is a brain teaser that I hope is obvious, but which of these application methods is more targeted? I hope you can tell. The point here is the more targeted we can be in terms of timing and method of application, the less drift we create, the less chemical we use, the less likely we are creating a hazard for pollinators. So I know we're getting close to the end here. I have one case study of how we can manage invasive species while mitigating risk to pollinators, and then I'll wrap up and leave it open for questions. but wanted to talk about a specific example of how you might mitigate the risk of herbicide use to pollinators. So this is our first example, giant hogweed. Our only example, giant hogweed, which is toxic to people, perennial, that reaches 15 feet tall and grows in both urban and rural areas of the Midwest, the Northeast, the Pacific Northwest. You would probably notice it if you spotted it. This is a person for scale. So in sun, giant hogweed sap that contacts skin can cause severe blisters and even scars. So it can be a hard plant to remove. You don't need a Tyvek suit like is in this photo, but long sleeves and work gloves are definitely recommended. But the thing about hogweed is, like Japanese knotweed and many other flowering weeds, is that its flowers are attractive to pollinators. So we need to be aware of how to manage the species. If herbicides are used when the plant is in bloom, pollinators could be taking it up in nectar in the couple of days before that plant responds to the chemical. Early on, in infestations of giant hogweed, the plant can be dug out, but later on, digging is a real job. So every part of this plant can lead to blistering, and that full coverage is needed if you're going to try and dig something out. Mowing and tilling in this case are largely ineffective at preventing spread, so larger, more mature infestations may need chemical control. But how can you manage that without harming pollinators? So the key with this species, as with many others that are prolific seed producers, is to get ahead of management before it sets seed. So in this case, there's a 2-for-1 answer for managing the weed effectively while protecting pollinators. Clipping off flowering umbels, as seen in this photo, does the dual job of reducing seed production and reducing exposure risks for pollinators, if you're also wanting to apply herbicides to the plants when they're in flowering stage. Clip the umbels to stop next year's spread and carefully apply herbicides to kill the existing plants. So that's a framework case study for how it might be done in terms of reducing risk to pollinators and effectively managing a plant. I thought it would be useful at this point to just summarize what we've talked about today. Herbicides have impacts on pollinators across agricultural landscapes, rangeland, forested areas, residential areas. Broad-scale use of herbicides is reducing habitat for pollinators, reducing quality of food for these insects, and maybe causing some level of direct harm by impacting reproduction, foraging behavior, and immune function. So in general, we need to be using less herbicide. But the other side of the coin is that they can be an effective tool for restoring and enhancing native plant communities that benefit pollinators. This use of herbicides is more within our control as conservation practitioners. So how can we reduce risk to pollinators from herbicides in conservation work? We need to be reducing exposure by integrating non-chemical management strategies to use less herbicides. And when they are used, using more targeted methods that avoid direct contact with pollinators or drift onto flowering plants. In general, what's our position on herbicide use? Xerces encourages the establishment and restoration of flowering habitat to support pollinators, other wildlife. We strive to create high-quality habitat that best supports wildlife, persists for the long haul. We're doing this by selecting diverse native species mixes, protecting habitat from drift and pesticide contamination, limiting the impact of any intervention on at-risk species, and encouraging non-chemical methods when feasible and effective, like smother cropping and sheet mulching and sod cutting. Managing weeds is an important part of establishing and maintaining diverse native plant communities over the long term. And we recognize that lots of different weed management techniques can have environmental trade-offs. Also recognize that targeted herbicide use can be part of this restoration process to manage aggressive species at sites where other methods aren't feasible. So we're always assessing herbicide use by the end goal. Will the long-term gains for wildlife from restored native habitat outweigh the impacts caused by short-term or targeted herbicide use? Last slide here. Most of this talk has focused on herbicide uses in agricultural and natural areas, but I did want to end by talking about home use. I want to note that our philosophy or our position is somewhat different when it comes to the home landscape. Herbicides are the most commonly applied pesticides in urban areas, applied in gardens and lawns and golf courses. They're generally applied to much smaller areas, but are often applied more frequently and in larger per area amounts. in towns and cities. They're also routinely applied to pavement cracks and paved surfaces. And when it rains, those chemicals can be washed away into soil and waterways. Sometimes those premixed products for home use can contain herbicide at concentrations that are many times higher than what would be typically used in an agricultural setting. They can also be hidden in other lawn care products like weed and feed fertilizer granules. So lots of those weed and feed products are actually 2,4-D or a mix of different herbicides mixed in with fertilizer. Those herbicide products for lawn care can move away from where they are applied, potentially impacting other garden or landscape plants in the area. So our philosophy on home use is different. In these small spaces that are more readily managed by hand, we want to be leaning more into doing what we can to embrace our yards as habitat and avoid use of pesticides in these spaces. That means hand weeding and mulching to deal with weeds, creating resilience to weeds and pests through diversity of native plantings, or designating areas of the lawn or the yard that could be managed less intensely. So if you employ land care professionals, also talk to them about reducing their use of pesticides. We're wanting to be planting resilient, diverse plantscapes. If you're interested in digging in more, we have a lot of resources available on our website, xerces.org, ranging from publications diving into organic pesticides, fungicide impacts, really in-depth report on neonicotinoid insecticides. And we currently have 2 fact sheets in review on herbicide impacts. So we'll be publishing those later this summer. Stay tuned. And if you've gone on our website and looked through everything and you feel like there's a subject that needs more attention or you can't find info about, please get in touch with us and let us know. We are often writing these guides in response to questions and concerns that are voiced to us. So with that, I think I've taken up most of this hour, but I'm happy to stick around for a while and answer questions. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Emily. We're getting lots of really good questions, so we're just going to dive right in, and I know May is going to join us to answer these as well. And just for the audience, so you know, you can upvote the questions that you're seeing. So if there's one you see on there that you're interested in, feel free to like that and it'll upvote it. We're going to start off with Joseph. Had a few really good questions, a little bit about bee behavior. So they have sometimes encountered dead bees or bees unable to fly. They suspect it's because the use of pesticides. Is there any reporting system to alert someone? And they believe that they can use the EPA, but their neighbor found over 100 dead bees a few years ago, and they were not sure where to report it.
I can answer that. Is that?
Sure, go for it.
So you're right. The EPA does have an incident reporting system. And if you go online, you can move to that system through actually the National Pesticide Information Center. But basically, if you put in incident report pollinators, you can get to the ways to report that incident. Sometimes in many states, your state Department of Agriculture can also be a part of evaluating a potential incident to see if it was pesticides that were the cause. Oftentimes they have thresholds. You said 100 bees. That would be a threshold where, like where I live in Oregon, the state could come out and investigate. It's tricky. These bees often, when you have an incident, they're going to die quickly. They desiccate. Some of these chemicals would no longer be able to be found. But if you're able to act very quickly and see if an agent can come out, it can be really helpful to understand. And if you can also do some investigating yourself to find out what kind of applications might have happened in the area. Is it a tree that they were all foraging on and that tree was recently treated? That's kind of the incidents we mostly hear about. So, and if you want to, you can reach out to us later. We can talk more about what you might do as far as to get these incidents reported.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would add to that is that before you've had a chance to, go online and find out your state regulatory agency as well and where you could report incidents, one thing you can do if you find dead bees is quickly put them into a Ziploc bag and stick them in the freezer. If you're thinking it's a pesticide impact, and feel free to chime back in, May, but that might help some of that pesticide from degrading, breaking down, and might help it end up in the residue sample if you get it sent off for testing.
I almost said that, and it's even better if they are still alive. And for people who, that is hard to say. The only thing is some regulatory agencies might be concerned that you've tampered with but overall, I know here in Oregon, they would definitely say, get a clean Ziploc bag, collect as many as you can. You actually need about a coffee cup full, which is really hard for native bees. You're not going to find that, right? Unless it's really devastating and maybe some bumblebees. But yeah, tough questions.
Coffee cup is a lot for a small native bee. That's a lot.
You're not going to have it. And so we're not going to, there's questions later about the difference between honeybee and native bees. And that's one of the really tough ones, is that it's not going to be as obvious as a bee kill for honeybees.
Yeah. So Joseph also had a follow-up question. They live in an HOA, which I'm assuming uses pesticides, and they'll see bees walking around in circles or acting like they're drunk. Could that also be an impact from pesticide use?
It can be. Bee behavior is a little complicated. Sometimes it can be, there are tilia plants where bees are drinking the nectar and they get kind of disoriented and drunken just from the mannose, the kind of sugar that's in that tree nectar. So there's other things that could be contributing to that besides pesticides. But yeah, that is a behavior that can occur from pesticide poisoning in a bee, or just general disorientation, shivering. Sometimes like guarding behaviors where a bee like sticks its leg up, or there are different behaviors that a bee might exhibit, and there are other reasons that they could be exhibiting those behaviors.
But if you know that your HOA is using pesticides and they have recently, those are acute incidents and they're pretty significant exposure levels. Sometimes what Emily was talking about are these really subtle, non-observable effects that are still going to cause harm. And this is an incident where you can say that, yeah, so it's worth trying to figure out and even calling those in and trying to see if regulators can come out and see if it's a sufficient exposure or number of bees.
Oh. All right, and then you sort of mentioned this question from Katie. How much can we extrapolate from the honeybees that aren't native to North America in terms of impacts on native pollinators?
I was going to maybe start, but I think Emily can go way deeper. And I was going to start by saying that that I'll tell you some of the differences, and then Emily can talk a little bit more. But when we're looking at native bees versus honeybees, we're talking about different behaviors. We're talking about different life stages and life cycles. We're talking about different sizes and ways of moving, which plants they may or may not go to. Some bees are specialists, only going to a few plants, whereas honeybees are generalists. There are a lot of differences that are going to impact whether they're going to be exposed and what that exposure might cause for a bee. That said, it is a baseline that is helpful when we look at honeybees, and I'll let Emily dive deeper.
Yeah, I think that you did a great job, May. But honeybees are used as this model organism for toxicity for all bees and all terrestrial invertebrates, all invertebrates on land. So that spans a really wide range of different types of animals. So they are better and worse at being a model organism for different types of insects, but they're not always a great proxy for how toxic something is for different bees or different other kinds of invertebrates like butterflies or beetles, etc. They might not be a good model for everything. Some species or groups of insects could be more sensitive to different pesticides, including different herbicides. So there are a few studies of herbicides on bees other than honeybees, and they found pretty wide ranges in sensitivity among just those species that have been, those non-honeybee species that have been tested. So there's a real need for deeper, broader research into herbicide effects on pollinators other than honeybees. We need to be looking at these solitary species that have these differences in their behavior and life history. We also need to be looking at, how might a big-bodied bee, a large-bodied bee differ from a small-bodied bee in their response? And then going beyond that to other types of pollinators as well.
One last thing that I always think is a very telling piece is when we're talking about honeybees, we're talking about huge, colonies with up to 50,000 bees can be really healthy. With our solitary bees, we have a single female that's provisioning a nest. And so if that female is exposed, there's no buffer of workers out there for a queen, right? If that female is exposed, her whole nest could potentially be lost if depending on the harm to her. So the buffer, I've seen statements that up to 25% of a honeybee colony can be lost without truly affecting the health of that colony. Question that either way, there is a buffer. If a worker is exposed, it isn't necessarily harming that superorganism of that colony. Really different. We don't have buffers for many of our native bees. Even bumblebees have really small colonies. We're talking tops a few hundred, not a few thousand. So, yeah.
This is so interesting. I'm getting so entranced. All right, next question's from Evelyn. They have a friend putting in a small lawn in their front yard and a pollinator garden, but they mentioned that the lawn guy is going to spray herbicide first and then plant the lawn. What can they do to mitigate this danger?
And so I was going to add to that, and then I'll let you answer. But what can we do to mitigate the danger? And also, if you could also talk about, which you did before, what are there other options that could be considered, as well as then if herbicides make sense in this instance, how we mitigate. So
Yeah, so that I think, like I mentioned, when you were looking at different site prep options, what's going to be feasible and effective is going to differ depending on like the scale that's happening. So if it is a small area for planting, this is where we are recommending looking at something like sheet mulching or sod cutting. If the existing vegetation is like a turf grass lawn and you're ripping it out and planting wildflowers, look into sod cutting, look into sheet mulching. You probably have cardboard coming in from your various online orders. You probably could get some wood chips pretty easily. That's an effective way of managing a small area before planting a pollinator meadow. In terms of if there's a site that's larger, or if it's, you have competitive weeds that are going to be challenging to manage, sod cutting is not going to be an option. It's looking at talking to the applicator, making sure that the application method is going to reduce drift as much as possible, that the herbicide being used is as non-persistent as possible. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this section, but those are the things that come to mind, making sure that the application is happening on a day where it's not super windy and that application is just going right onto the area being treated and is not, drifting off by wind to other areas around it.
No, I was just going to say that but Emily actually just rented a sod cutter and was putting in a bit of habitat in her yard right now. Yeah. So
it really wasn't too bad. It worked pretty well.
And we're staying on, and everyone some folks are sliding off. Thank you all so much for coming. Yeah,
I know I took up a lot of time there with that presentation, so I'm happy to stick around.
No, it's okay. We have definitely still a lot of folks here and a lot of good questions. So we'll go for a few more minutes here and get a couple more questions in. Just a couple of people are asking, this is recorded and it'll be on our YouTube channel by tomorrow evening, most likely. So you can share it. And then if you have to leave, you can skip to the end and watch the rest of these questions.
When there's great things, read the chat, everybody. I just saw chaparral bees, and don't be afraid to say no landscapers recommending herbicides. Many don't know about the risks. There's so much knowledge in the audience. It's always hard when it's the two of us sitting up here, and I know we can be absorbing from each other. So there was a comment about knotweed and mowing that I flagged at one point that we'll get to or not, hopefully, but I wanted to hear more, and yeah.
Thank you, May. So we do have a policy question that you flagged from Jeremy. Do we need new laws to regulate pesticides and help at-risk invertebrate populations? Why hasn't government done more?
It's not an easy answer. It's not an easy question. It's like a couple of words to, for a lifetime of explaining. But yes, our current regulatory system has a lot of gaps. We with our native bees and overall with ecological protections, we are not where we need to be in order to create protections. We are seeing across the board, wherever we look, we're finding pesticides, whether it be in our bodies, whether it be in our rivers and streams, in our pollinator habitat, in our foods. So we do need to take a step back about both the practices that are on the ground and how we regulate. And it is not easy because we are in this system where people have become accustomed to the practices that are in place. So it's a real hard thing to shift people's practices that they've become dependent upon. And yes, we need more regulations. Yes, we can do that at the local level. We can make changes in asking, self-regulate yourself at the local level in your town, in your city. And we need to be pushing at the state and federal level to be making changes. We could go on for a long time about what they could be. It could be everything from making sure we regulate treated seed. Pesticides can be on a seed without even having it be without knowing where they're being planted or having that oversight. So it's a big question, and I'm glad you asked it because it is part of the toolbox of solutions. Part is helping educate and outreach and helping people make changes on their own. And also sometimes when the risk is great enough, we do need to push for regulatory and legislative changes.
Thank you, May. So most upvoted question is from Fran, and they are still on this call or on this webinar. So I thought I'd throw this one out here. In the last 10 years, they've begun to see more widespread use of glyphosate on farm fields to kill off cover crops in the spring so the farmer can plant the main crop. Is there any work being done to find a better way to manage cover crops without using herbicides?
So yes, hi Fran, good to see you on the webinar. Yeah, there are other ways to manage herbicides. There's some great work out of Rodale Institute on, how you could use a roller crimper to take down a cover crop and leave it on the soil surface before the farmer is planting a main crop and then planting in after rolling and crimping the cover crop. It's going to depend on your cover crop species, but in a lot of cases, there are better ways to manage cover crops and terminate cover crops without herbicides.
All right, another question from Kathy. How long does a glyphosate stay in herbaceous plants versus woody plants?
That's a great question. I'd have to look that up.
Yeah, I should, if we keep going through the questions, I'll dig online. We might not have information about herbaceous versus woody. One thing that we can say is that when something is in a woody plant, it's oftentimes going to be a lot more stable of an environment and can last longer. But and half-life is extremely fickle, depending on where you are, the temperatures, the sunlight, and whether it's moving off-site, what other organisms are in the area that might help degrade. So whatever answer we give you, we'll have a million caveats around it, but I'll see what I can find. I'll keep going.
Yeah, I mean, I think something like the half-life in soil can range anywhere from a couple of days to almost a year. For glyphosate, it's just going to depend on your environmental conditions, but I don't have a number offhand on residues inside of plants, woody and herbaceous plants. I mean, glyphosate affects many different kinds of plants, and those plants might senesce pretty quickly after a glyphosate application. There was a study that came out in the last year or two about how glyphosate residues in soil can affect leaf quality of plants growing in that soil. So glyphosate is commonly used across all of agriculture, and plants growing in glyphosate contaminated soils can have less nutritive plants, nutritive leaves for things feeding on those plants, where the plants aren't actually dying from the residues, but they're taking up a little bit and enough to affect the quality of those leaves for herbivores like butterfly caterpillars.
All right, another question from Vivian, who is still here. It's interesting. Since invasive plants are often a sign of soil mineral imbalance, a land care professional in the Berkshires uses mineral supplements to rebalance the soil and prevent growth or regrowth of invasives. Has the Xerces Society considered this approach to manage invasives and achieve ecological balance without using herbicides?
That's super interesting. I mean, I know that there are different plants that are going to grow differently depending on, what's present in that soil, the soil type, the pH. There's a lot of different things that are going to affect how how well different plants grow and establish in those soils. So I could imagine a number of approaches to get the soil conditions closer to what you would need to establish a native plant community and make it less hospitable for invaders. But I'll have to look into that more and find out the specifics.
Yeah, I really was interested in that myself as well. In fact, it might be part of what we can look into for our organic site prep ideas, where that fits in. So thank you.
All right, so we're gonna end on one more question. And it's from Jane. She's not here anymore, but I mean, you had flagged it about never mow, not weed. And I'm curious as to why you flagged it and you mentioned it again. So your chance.
I was hoping that they could respond and give us a little bit more input. Emily May, I don't know if you know more about that. You mentioned that. I think that's when they brought it out. So I'm guessing it might lead to more
I'm happy to answer. I'm happy to answer this question. Knotweed is a plant that cannot be managed just with mowing. When it is mowed, it vigorously resprouts. And it can sprout from various parts of the plant. So mowing can actually spread the infestation of knotweed. It has to be a combination of mowing with an herbicide application. This is an example of a plant that is quite challenging to manage without chemical intervention. So thanks for bringing that question up. But it is, there are conditions under which you wouldn't want to mow knotweed, which is if mowing is the only intervention that you're using. Cutting it back every year, unfortunately, doesn't seem to be enough to take care of it.
All right, thank you. I definitely lied. I'm going to ask one more question. A few people have just mentioned food. When they eat food that has been, treated at some point with glyphosate, how is that impacting them? And Mary wants to know, am I eating glyphosate when corn crop ends up in my dinner? And I think a lot of people probably do wonder that.
So this is a tough one. We're not always human health experts, but my perspective is you likely are ingesting some residues of glyphosate through food. There's glyphosate residues, to my knowledge, are in a lot of urine that has been collected from human samples. People ingest glyphosate from a variety of sources or are exposed to it because it's applied all around us. That said, the dose of glyphosate that's going to affect a bee is quite a bit different than the dose of glyphosate that's going to result in measurable health impacts on people. That's generally true across many of these agricultural or other agrochemicals. And May, if you have other thoughts on this, I would love to hear them. But the dose that is showing up in our food is not going to be nearly as concerning to us as it would be for a pollinator encountering that same dose.
And I would then just go back to all of the, you mentioned just how ubiquitous these exposures are. And most humans that we're testing, we are finding glyphosate. And maybe it's not a level that we know causes harm. But to me, that's the inspiration to say we need to find a better system. We do need to make some changes. Our current structure is broken, whether it's regulatory, it's practice, it's behavior, it's shifting what we're doing so that we don't have to wonder if the exposure that we're finding in our food is going to cause harm.